Welcome to the second in the Millennial Debt Foundation's Stewardship Series. We started this about a month ago in Austin, Texas, and wanted to hit some of the hot spots in the country. So if you're going to start in Austin, you better end up in Nashville, and that's where we are. I'm Weston Wamp, the founder of the Millennial Debt Foundation, and this thing's my idea. The thought is that we get around the country and take the conversation about the fiscal future of America out to the people, talk to local and state and federal officials, but out with the people who are going to deal with the consequences of what has become historic and experimental deficit spending. And when we come to Tennessee, we wanted it to reflect the culture of our state. We want each of these really to carry a theme that's reflective of the state that we're in. And Tennessee's the best run state in the country. And so we're honored today that our three most recent governors are going to join us to talk about, frankly, how Washington has a lot to learn from Tennessee. And we're honored to start with the former mayor of Knoxville and the 49th governor of the great state of Tennessee, Bill Haslam. Thank you, sir.
Good to be here. You got it backwards. You should have started here and then worked your way to Austin. But
well, that's fair.
It's okay.
That's fair. I know. It was this, in some ways, an ode to the young Congressman Dan Crenshaw. Has been very supportive of our efforts. And
all right, we'll give you a break.
And it's hard to schedule three governors. You know?
That's true. It's kind of, yeah.
So we're glad that you guys are all going to join us. Let's start here. So your administration as governor was the last 6 years of the Obama administration, the first two of the Trump era.
Right.
You came into office, obviously President Obama was seeing us out of a recession. The federal deficit ballooned to $1.4 trillion. We fiscal conservatives were going, what have we done?
Yeah.
What are the consequences?
Yeah.
As the economy recovered, deficits shrunk under, and it sounds really small these days, under $500 billion. And then Trump gets elected, and conservatives preside over a rise, even in an economic boom, to deficits over $1 trillion. And this is before the pandemic. So we're talking before the pandemic. I was asking all along, and I really, in hindsight, wonder what has happened to fiscal conservatism.
You know, it's a fair question because as a Republican, I can say we've been as guilty as anyone else. We haven't, you know, we've talked a good game on being fiscally conservative, but it hasn't happened. And even in some of our times in the past, we've said, well, the theory of fiscal conservatism is not only are you going to cut taxes, but you have to shrink government as well. And one of those is easy to do, one of those is hard. And we've done better, I'm going back 40 years at cutting taxes than we have at actually shrinking government. Everybody, I actually stole this from Governor Bredesen you're getting ready to talk to. Everybody says they want smaller government until you actually do it. And then they say, oh, that's the part I like. And I think we've been guilty of that too.
So you said as you were governing, I think you always did a good job. Labels are as toxic as they've ever been in politics. You avoided labels, I think, pretty well as a mayor and as a governor. And I heard you say when you were governor that at the end of the day, you wanted to give people $1 worth of service for $1 of taxes. Boy, that feels like a governing mantra for conservatives moving forward.
Yeah.
But Washington now is just their default position is to borrow. So it almost doesn't even matter how much is coming in the door.
I think there's two places we've messed up. Number one, this idea that, government actually has a right role. The analogy I use, it's like fire. Out of control, it's a problem. Under control, it cooks our food, it warms our buildings, and all those things. And our job is to use it for its proper purposes and not let it get out of control. And one of the beautiful things about being a mayor and a governor is you have to do that. You have to balance the budget. And I always say, being a mayor makes the most liberal people conservative, and it makes some conservative people do some things that they might not have thought they would do just because it's such a practical, fix-the-problem job.
Right. Well, when you're a mayor or when you're a governor, you go through this budget process. I was at a deal a couple days ago with the Senate Finance Chairman here in Tennessee, Bo Watson. And Bo loves to give these presentations about the budget because he knows it as well as anybody, but the governors. And he made a reference. You and I got to know each other through young life, like long before politics. And he made this reference to Matthew, where Matthew makes this reference to where your treasure is, there also you'll find your heart. And it is an interesting budgeting principle, but it also makes me wonder if this is in some ways the key to understanding how wildly different Washington is right now, culturally, its mindset, its attitude, than Tennessee, or for that matter, the city of Knoxville.
I think that what people miss about government is you're not deciding between good things and bad things. You're deciding between good things and other good things, but you can't pay for all of it. So should you cover more disabled people? or should you give more money to people who you're already covering who are disabled? I use that as an example. Being in state government and city government forces you to make hard choices. And, you know, should you pay teachers more or build more sidewalks? But we can do it. I think what we've seen in Tennessee, and I'm glad you're talking to Governor Bredesen and Governor Lee, is we have a history of doing that. Governor Bredesen was in office when the Great Recession of 2008 hit. And remember, all the stimulus money came into the state. And
right.
When I was running for governor with your dad and others, one of the conversations we had was, all that money's going away, and we have to pick up and take on the obligations of the state without that federal money. And everybody's like, how are we going to do it? We actually had a Democratic governor who laid out a roadmap and said, here's how we can do that. And then we picked up that roadmap. We changed it a little bit, but we said, yeah, we can take that federal money that we had been using, take it out of the budget, and make it work. So I think one of the things you need to do in government is look and see, can that happen? And the truth is, it can. And we've proved it, and a lot of other states have too.
Right. It seems to me that in Washington right now, you've got, first of all, a great dysfunction, and you've got a few people who seem to run the show.
Right.
But you've got also at an ideological level, across party lines, a seriousness about what we're doing, and the pandemic has warranted deficit spending.
Sure.
And we've been pretty clear about
Right.
that. Now, whether it warranted $6 trillion,
Right.
we've now in 1 year spent more, this is an amazing statistic. Adjusted for inflation, we've now spent more in 12 months on COVID than we did in 4 years of World War II. Adjusted for inflation.
Right.
So we've done everything and beyond that's ever been tried in human history to bring some, you know, fiscal calm to the situation. But I sense that in Washington, governors think about this differently. Like I saw that Angus King,
Right.
the former governor of Maine,
Right.
who's an independent but caucuses
Right.
with the Democrats, today was saying, we're going to have to pay for stuff eventually.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, you know, my hope here, and we're a Tennessee-based organization, and one of the reasons that we're proudly Tennessee-based, and Hamilton County is the highest, you know, credit-rated county in the state, and Tennessee's this kind of beacon for taking care of your business, is that Tennesseans would take an interest in the way that we have conducted business. And again, this has been a bipartisan thing.
Right. To me, you talked about the current COVID relief plan and the $1.9 trillion that we just passed. There's 2 or 3 issues I have with that. Number one, if you look at how much money is being spent, I don't think people realize, like in Tennessee, we're going to get over $3 billion just for education, okay, to address things. When 12 years ago, Tennessee won the Race to the Top funding that the Obama administration did, we got $500 million. We were awarded that under Bredesen, but we were the ones who it was implemented under us. We had to work hard to thoughtfully spend $500 million because you can't increase salaries because it's one-time money, and you had to do it in a limited period of time. I look at the amount of money that's going to come into the state for education now, and the lack of definity around how you use that money, and I hope that most of it gets spent in a thoughtful way. But the amount of money going out to states and cities is just unfathomable. Number 2, there's an opportunity cost, right? What you talk about, you're rightfully saying my generation is going to inherit all this debt, but debt comes in different forms. Sometimes debt comes in the form of, if I'm passing on the family farm to you, but the barn leaks and the fencing's down, et cetera, that's debt too, right? It's just long-term maintenance that I haven't taken care of, so you inherit that debt as well. And I look at this as saying there's opportunity cost involved. We're doing this instead of addressing some real infrastructure needs that need to happen in the country and are going to have to be paid for too. So we're passing that debt to you too, as like real infrastructure needs haven't been met, you're going to have to pay for that too. I think the third thing is it always, the issue with debt, and you might, like I said, you appropriately said in COVID, some stimulus spending is probably warranted. The question is the amount. And the question also gets to be, whenever you're living beyond your means, you get used to doing that. And then when you take that money out, now there's a big adjustment. And that adjustment period will happen when this money comes out of the budgets.
Well, when I think about your principle of, let's just go give taxpayers $1 worth of services.
Right.
One problem with Washington even being serious about that is that the default position for so long on both sides of the aisle has become, well, we're going to borrow. You know, we're Americans, and this is, I think, also the positioning. We're Americans, and therefore, because we're the economic power of the world, we're going to go test our borrowing capacity. And it's gotten to be, you know, 20 cents on every dollar, 25 cents on every dollar, and $1 trillion, $3 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see. It's hard to set priorities for one, but how can you be a good steward and really be focused on giving people a return on their taxpayer dollars when you've just allowed yourself, you've basically entered an environment where there are no constraints?
Well, I think that's fair. And again, let me say, the amount of money that's going out to cities and states in this plan and being able to thoughtfully spend it in that period of time is really hard. And I have great confidence in Governor Lee and his administration, but it will be a major job to have great stewardship over those funds coming into us.
Right.
I think the other thing about this plan that, you know, like I said, when they poll the American people, they say, well, everybody's in favor. I mean, it's overwhelmingly positive. But if you start breaking it down, I mean, do you remember in the Obama stimulus plan, there was the whole, or actually prior to that, there was the whole bank bailout deal. Right. And how controversial that was, okay? Well, this actually has $68 billion going to bail out multi-company union pension plans that were underfunded. You might say, well, okay, I get why they do it, but there's two things. It's not required to pay it back. The banks were required to pay it back. And then number two, there's no requirement that you fix the structural imbalance of those pension plans. So it's one thing for me to say, you're behind, COVID's made it worse, let's level this out. It's a whole nother thing to say, you don't have to fix the structural imbalance that got you in the problem to begin with.
If you know, unless you've served in Washington for more than 25 years, you might not have seen the place go through the budget process in the appropriate way. It's a foreign concept there. But between your time as mayor and governor, we've got another mayor and turned governor who will be here in a minute, you put together somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 or 15 budgets. Yeah. What was your approach to it? I do think it's a healthy process. We all do it as families. Those budgets do reflect the things that we care about the most.
It's not all that different than what you do as a family. I mean, the zeros are bigger, and the needs are more varied. I mean, you have, one of the things about a state, you think about all the different businesses you're in. You know, you're building highways, you're educating 4-year-olds, you're educating PhD students, you're helping people with mental health issues. You know, the list goes on. Within that, most of the needs are good ones, but you have a limited amount of funds coming into you. So you sit around the table literally, and for really, at the state, we turned in the budget end of January. We started about mid-October, literally line through line and need through need going through that, making hard calls. And there were a lot of things, particularly in our early years when the state's revenue was lower, when we were coming out of the recession, where we said no to some things that I hated to say no to. I mean, they were real needs. But at the end of the day, you had to balance it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's such a fascinating concept. See, you dealt, and you were reelected. So you're not just elected governor, but you were also reelected in a time frame where you had to make tough decisions and then go explain to voters why you did them and why you should be reelected. I think the easiest justification or rationalization for the way Washington works is they get so obsessed over the election cycle that nobody can govern longer term. But at a state level and a local level, you see it done all the time, where mayors will just level with their city and say, we can't do these things yet. We can't do these things.
I mean, the truth is, it's another reason I tend to like the conservative point of view. The closer to home government is, typically the better people feel about it. They know. I mean, listen, when I was mayor, I could tell you how many police cars we had in this. Okay, I mean, I knew because we were controlling it. When I was governor, I couldn't tell you how many state highway patrol vehicles there are. I mean, as the numbers get bigger, you can't wrap your arms around it. And it's one of the issues is the country has gotten so big, nobody can have a fathomable idea of what the cost is. Here's the other big thing about government is you just treat it different when it's not your money. And an example I give is this. We move into the governor's residence. Chrissy is, you know, after a while she's saying, I want to see the bills for this place. And because, I mean, I'm kind of responsible. I want to see the bills. And so she kept asking, and I said, we'll get them to you. It took about a year for her to finally see a utility bill, and she saw a water bill that was, I don't remember the number, it was out the roof. And I'm like, well, it's just the two of us living here, and there's an irrigation system here, but we're not. Well, it turns out that, you know, when they'd done some prior work, somebody had cut a pipe, and there was a water leak. Okay? If that's your house, you figure that out pretty quick because you're looking at your utility bill every month. Well, this one nobody was looking at. That's the issue as you get bigger and bigger. who's worrying about it the way you worry about your dollars at home? That's the fundamental problem.
Yeah. We call this thing the Stewardship Series. I do, just in my heart of hearts, wish that on both sides of the aisle, elected officials from the top to the bottom would begin thinking, and there's a commitment because it doesn't allow for all easy choices, would begin thinking about policy in our country long term. We've not done this, especially in Washington. You know, you hear, it's almost a type of political salesmanship to some of these deals where it almost feels like on both sides of the aisle, you might be trying to buy favor, win favor that way. I feel like in a small way, I'm on the Tennessee Board of Regents, so I feel like I walk in a unique part of your legacy.
Right.
Because you guys set up, and there are several people I'm sure you'd share the credit with, but we're unique in that if you're, almost any Tennessean can go get a 2-year degree or certificate in our state for free. And it was attached to a program that was designed to train a workforce. But it was all designed around the year 2025 being the goal. And you knew when you started it, you wouldn't be the governor anywhere close to 2025. I don't know, when's the last time that anybody in Washington talked about something that you know will come to harvest in 2025?
I think it's a really fair question. I think, but like everything else, you always, part of the problem is us, being all of us who vote. And you know, we get really fired up and upset about, you know, Dr. Seuss books or whatever the current hot thing is today that's going to hit the cable shows. But one of the discouraging things to me as time has gone on is the issues that really matter, nobody really wants to dig into. And part of it, you know, is the difference in the media world that we live in. Their business is hard. There's multiple channels. They've got to keep folks entertained. And digging into hard issues about, okay, the 1.9 trillion, that sounds like a good plan. My family's going to get, you know, $7,000 for our 4 kids and my wife and I, you know, the theoretical family. But it's a lot harder to dig in and say, what's the opportunity cost of doing this? Where's all the money going? How are we going, you know, what are the ultimate implications? That's harder, and our short attention spans have contributed to that.
Well, and if you're not careful, like you said, you're fed the hype, you know, the latest controversy, not the policies that might actually affect a family of 6 like my family.
That 10 years from now are really going to matter.
I think will really matter, right? And we've lost that perspective. The last question is this. You were a young business person, came out of an incredible business legacy. You decided to enter public service as a mayor, and then ran for governor. I wonder, so our organization really is oriented primarily towards bringing younger elected officials, younger business leaders together. Why should, in this era of, you know, spite on the right and the left, why should particularly young business people care to engage and ask these questions?
That is such a great, for this reason. You might just say, well, I'm going to run my business. I'm going to let that worry about itself. The one thing that I learned after being a mayor and a governor for 15 years is all of this matters a lot more than you think it does. And it matters who we elect to office more than you think it does. And what government can do, it can leverage all the responsibility it has to really produce that dollar's worth of value for the dollar's worth of taxes paid, or it can get distracted by all of the shiny toys that roll across the floor. And I think what business people, you can come from a lot of different backgrounds, what business people can bring is this sense of, ultimately there's a P&L that has to balance. And you have to make that work, and you have to understand it.
Or if it doesn't balance, I think at least accept the consequences or talk about them. We try and I'll wrap up with this, we try to approach the subjects of the national debt and the long-term deficits through a lens of at least humility. I don't think there's certainty. It's all, to an extent, theoretical economics. But we should, I think, have the humility to at least ask the hard questions.
True. Glad you're doing it.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
I'm grateful. All right, give us 2 minutes to reset the stage, and we'll be joined by Governor Phil Bredesen. Thanks. Antiquated term, but I actually hope, and in fact, I think a lot of my efforts on a daily basis are in hopes that the future of America is federalism, which really would get us back to our roots. I mean, it's not all that long ago that we still would point to the 10th Amendment and say, shouldn't the federal government just do what it's supposed to do? Of course, I think if it would, it'd be a whole lot easier to pay the bills, so to speak. with federalism in mind, when you, and in your role, you interact with the federal government more than you'd like to. So both as land commissioner, but then also as a grandson of one of the great Americans, when you look at Washington today in 2021, what do you think? What do you see?
I think it's horribly broken. I think it's drifted way too far from what the founders contemplated, which you alluded to in your prior remarks, and that relates to the Constitution. And the contemplation at the time when the drafters came together was to have a limited government that was focused on some very simple things, and to only be involved in the state's management of issues on a limited array. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in terms of interpretation of the Constitution, whether it's the 14th Amendment and other amendments that now neglect the 10th Amendment. Most school kids, including in Texas, when they come through, they don't learn about the 10th Amendment, nor do they learn about the 9th Amendment, which preserves individual rights that are not enumerated for the federal government. And so that's a problem, is the failure of civics in our country, the failure of civics in our high schools, whether it's here in Texas. And so I don't have an easy solution to what's happening in DC, but I do see a government that's run amok in terms of its power, in terms of its debt, that is now saddling future generations, sadly. And being a father of four and father of two, that's what I think about, is what kind of country are they going to inherit? And it's looking like it'll be a bankrupt one.
Well, we're honored to be joined by the 48th governor of Tennessee, former mayor of Nashville, and really just on the front end, thank you for doing this. Thank you for making this a bipartisan event. We're a nonpartisan organization, and it just really honors our cause that you would come and spend some time with us. Right here, in front of the house that Bredesen built, the Titan Stadium's right behind us. So
well, there's a few other things.
And then my colleague, Lindsay Conrad, at the Millennial Debt Foundation, is going to kind of co-steward this conversation with me.
Good.
Right.
Look forward to it.
Well, thanks for being here, Governor. So I'll just go ahead and jump into the first question, which I think is the meat and potatoes of why we're all here, and that is, does government debt ultimately matter? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think absolutely it does. It's something that has bothered me for a long time about the federal government. At the state, of course, and at the city here, we have very strong balanced budget requirements, so you don't get into that issue. You have to pay for things as they happen. At the federal level, it's gotten just out of hand, and it's really happened in my lifetime. If you remember back in the Lyndon Johnson days, he went through these elaborate kind of process to try and get the budget to have a surplus, even though the Vietnam War was going on. They changed the accounting principles and everything. That was at a time at which it really mattered. Right. To a lot of people. And of course, since then, we've totally fallen off the wagon, and the assumption is now that you have trillion-dollar deficits going on indefinitely. It's unfortunate, and it's very hurtful.
What a lot of people don't realize, they see this nebulous number. It's about to pass $30 trillion. And I think particularly one of the reasons that I started the organization was because the $30 trillion is not nearly as big a problem as the fact that we have no plan whatsoever from here. And the current CBO projections, when you're 33, a 30-year timeline seems pretty reasonable. Fair?
Yeah.
And so when you look at those long-term CBO projections, you show that we're planning to borrow well in excess of 100 trillion more. And then what a lot of folks don't realize even there is that roughly of that 100 trillion, these are round numbers, about 20 trillion of that is government outside of Medicare and Social Security. But the lion's share of the growth of government and the growth of debt comes in, well, the majority is just in Medicare alone. So two-part question. I mean, you made a living and started great businesses in the healthcare sector, and you've presumably been on Medicare. You know it up close and personal, so you know these things. But talk to us about the cost of healthcare, because it is actually an issue that is intimately connected to the fiscal health of the nation.
Right. Well, I mean, as you know, in this country, we have healthcare costs that are complete outliers with regard to any place else in the world with similar kinds of outcomes that we have. And we have a great healthcare system. We just pay twice as much for it as a lot of other countries. And a lot of it has to do with the fact of the way it's paid for. I mean, the process of this very fee-for-service oriented system, employer health insurance as being the core of what we do. Helps with that. A reluctance on the part of the Congress to take any of the actions it would actually take to rein in things like drug costs and some of these other kinds of things. So that is, that's there. The difference now, I mean, the numbers you talk about, I mean, they're certainly there and they're serious. The difference before is, we've been at 100% of GDP as a debt at the end of World War II, for example. But that was because of an extraordinary event that ended. I mean, you have wars, you had depressions before that, but at some point they're over. And then what happened is the economy continued to grow and the debt as a percentage of GDP went back down again. That's very different from today. I mean, there's not some extraordinary thing out there which is causing this to happen. It just goes on and on and on. And that's the thing that I think people have really got to come to grips with, that there needs to be some change. We kind of get a pass right now because interest rates are so low. But if interest rates were at anything like the normal long-term historical levels, and I can't believe they won't ultimately be there, I mean, then an enormous fraction of the taxes we collect is simply going into servicing that debt and crowding out a lot of other important priorities like infrastructure.
Knowing that a majority of the problem long-term is Medicare. I mean, none of us, myself included, have got a lot of grandparents living. They probably wouldn't be real happy if they thought that my organization was simply focused on reducing, but again, a lot of times this conversation becomes fraught unnecessarily. I think, you've examined a lot of the proposals, bipartisan ones, to fix Medicare. At some point, we're going to come up on I think there'll be a forcing mechanism of some sort that brings Republicans and Democrats to the table to negotiate solutions or options. What are your thoughts about Medicare's long-term solvency, and what are some of the reasonable changes we might ought to consider?
Well, you say Medicare, but you have to put Medicaid in that,
sure,
as well. Those are two important components of what it is. I mean, one of the things that has to happen, obviously, is to charge premiums for Medicare, which are more realistic compared to the actual cost. I mean, I'm on Medicare now. I paid into it over the years through the payroll tax. I pay into it now through the Part B premiums. But realistically, neither of them were enough to actually fund what it is it costs for health care today. So, I mean, I think one of the things you have to do is deal with the revenue side. You just got to put the premiums where they realistically need to be to provide this kind of care. And I think once you do that, people will start focusing a lot more on the cost of health care. I mean, the problem, and Governor Haslam before me was talking about it a little bit, is that these things, they're so distant from one another. I mean, the things that affect you and your ability to affect them, that it doesn't have that tension. I mean, if we're sitting around as families, we make decisions all the time about, here's 3 good things we'd like to do, but I need to make some choices in here, and and I have to balance off where I live against how much I save for my kids' college, against how much we spend on vacations, against other kinds of things. The way the budgeting process works in the federal government, there's none of that tension into the thing. If you want more stuff in Medicare, you just do it, okay? And then somehow it fixes itself up here back on the back end through more borrowing. So I think one of the things that, just putting a more realistic costs on these things that people actually have to pay, I think starts to generate some interest in actually controlling those costs in the same way that it happens in your families.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, and shifting gears a little bit, and I can tell that federal debt is something that you know a lot about, and I think that's incredible. And so there's been a recent change in Washington that we've kind of been gradually seeing, and that's that some Democrats and a few Republicans as well are adhering to this concept of modern monetary theory, which of course is the notion that a government that prints its own money can borrow as much as it wants. And I think that's very different than the type of way that you govern the state of Tennessee, and I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
I think it's just absurd on the face of it. I'm very aware of that, and there's, what you would think of as perfectly respectable economists who keep waving their hands and doing that. But in the end, there's no free lunch here. I mean, at some point, if services are being provided over here, money's provided to do it, it comes from somewhere. And in a way, it's a mortgage on the country's future, I think of it. I mean, we have built this very strong economy. And when the government borrows money, what they're really doing is taking a mortgage out on the future production of that economy. And just like anything else, it's okay for you to have a realistic mortgage on your house. I don't have a problem with debt, as a way of helping to balance things. But you're also insane to assume that you can simply keep borrowing it to a point where it makes, you've mortgaged all of your future income, against this. And that's the position we're getting in. We're getting in now as a nation.
Well, I think our generation is certainly going to be feeling that pain, exactly as you shared. So I appreciate your sentiments.
Your
on that.
comments echo almost exactly
That's
a conversation that we had with former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, who basically said to the question of MMT, you invent whatever theory you want, but I refer to it as laws of gravity. Do we really believe the laws of gravity have all of a sudden relented, and we can now just go and print money and there's no consequence to any of it?
I mean, it's just sort of it's this, I don't know, this theoretical construct that it just seems to make no common sense. I mean, I've had a lot of experience over the years with people who get these highfalutin ideas off in a university somewhere or whatever in a think tank, and so on, but they don't meet any kind of common sense test of realism. And the notion that somehow there's free money and you can print it. And it has no other consequences. Well, that's great. Let's all just go home and go on vacation, and we'll just keep printing money, and everything will be fine.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way.
Well, if there's no limiting principle, I don't understand why the checks were only $1,400.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you could just keep going. When you think about, this is a question that's really seeking your opinion and just thoughts about the national body politic, and I'll use the same phraseology I used with Governor Haslam. I think when I was growing up, I thought I knew what being a fiscal conservative meant. Most political conservatives would also subscribe to some form of fiscal conservatism. A lot of Democrats would. Certainly a lot of moderates would. Probably covered easily the majority of the American political spectrum. In my opinion, what I hear from you is much more fiscally responsible, at least, and by the kind of traditional definition, more fiscally conservative than at least half of Republicans in Congress. I mean, there's certainly, populism plays a role in this, but there's some remaking of our politics, and I don't think we're quite understanding fully the ramifications of it.
Yeah, I think there are very few members of Congress who can honestly claim a fiscal conservative label, in the sense that, what I found was that there were lots of people who were happy to cut taxes. They talked about it, happy to cut taxes, but we're not interested in doing the other half of that, which is cutting the spending to go with it. I think of it a little bit like if you and your family are getting in financial trouble and in over your heads, and you've got a job you're working hard at, but you're spending too much money, the way you solve it is not to say, oh, I think I'll work less and get less income, and then maybe the spending will take care of itself over here on the side. I mean, that would be a stupid strategy, and yet that's exactly what a lot of this discussion is about now. No, what I found is Republicans are concerned about fiscal conservatism when Democrats are in power, and Democrats are concerned about it when Republicans are in power, but neither of them are serious about doing anything about it right now.
Well, we've talked a lot about federal issues, so I'd like to ask you a question from the state level perspective. And I think we got three proud Tennesseans up here on the stage. And one of the things that I'm most proud of being from Tennessee is seeing the massive amounts of investment, business investment, that's coming into the state every single day. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on why you think that Tennessee has become such a magnet for business success. And I know that when you were governor, you had to make some really difficult decisions at that point in time. And do you feel that kind of put us on the pathway to enjoy some of this business interest from all across the country that we're enjoying today?
Yeah, I certainly, as have other governors, certainly worked hard on trying to grow the top line, as it were, about bringing business to Tennessee. I had a particular interest in kind of mid-sized businesses to go into rural areas because that's where Nashville is doing fine, and so on. But there's a lot of rural areas that are really hurting. And what I found about it is that, you know, yes, you've got to do some things in the way of infrastructure or some help with education and these tax things that get talked about. You have to do that to get through the first gate. They all have a consultant of some sort, and you know, unless you're willing to do something there, you don't get through the gate. But after that, the stuff they're interested in is just things like predictability. I mean, Tennessee's reputation for Democrats honoring the commitments of Republicans and Republicans honoring the commitments of Democrats is a big plus. And so they come in and they feel like, yeah, I understand the environment here, and at both the local and the state level, I can look for a kind of a steady hand. It's not going to go swerving all around, and one year they love companies, and the next year they hate companies, and so on. I think that predictability is one of the things that's really important. The other thing, we have a good work ethic here, and I don't know how many people told me about, you know, over the years, told me about the differences in things like absenteeism rates here and other places they did business, and you know, that has helped us as well. So I mean, you know, it's an inexpensive state to do business in. People got a good work ethic. It's a solid government structure that doesn't run all over the place depending on who's in control. And you know, what's not to like about that if you're a company just trying to make your way in the world?
That's interesting. We talk about stewardship a lot. I think Tennessee is a state that over a long period of time, with Republicans in charge and Democrats in charge, and sometimes Republicans and Democrats working well together, have been good stewards. One of the reasons that I care about these issues is because I think they speak to some broader character questions about our country. You know, there is among young people, Lindsay and I think almost all of our friends would have some interest in the stewardship of the environment. Certainly almost everybody in the political left in America would pledge to have a real interest in the stewardship there. You know, as the governor said, you know, a P&L is not as interesting, you know, maybe as saving animals. But I think also, when I think about climate change, I think millennials think often that our parents might not have been such good stewards, and so we need to fix it. Is there something there? How would you talk to young Democrats or young liberals or young progressives even about how they might think about the type of fiscal irresponsibility that we see demonstrated, again, on both sides of the aisle in Washington?
I think you have to bring it home to them in terms of, as you've been doing here in this conversation, and as we both have, in terms of, you know, an analogy with their families. I mean, things that just strike you as something you read about in the newspaper or here on television having to do with the federal debt, they make much more sense when you bring it back home and kind of think of it in terms of, you know, what kind of decisions would I make if it were my family and you were doing these things. So I think that I think for anybody on any of these kinds of issues, getting it out of the realm of this abstract, highly politicized thing into some terms that somebody can relate to. I heard Governor Haslam talk earlier about just the, you know, the difference in scale that happens. I think that's one of the big problems. He's hit the nail on the head, and but bringing it home in a way that people understand it, I think, really helps with that. When I was working, you were talking about environmental stuff. When I was governor, we worked hard at preserving a bunch of land. I mean, I think we ultimately acquired several 100,000 acres of land to be public land. And you know, the way we got that done was just talking to people about, you want your kids to have a place to go fish and hunt, not about, you know, airy things about the environment and this kind of thing. And people, you know, anybody relates to that. It's just human nature.
There's a harshness to the politics in Washington.
Oh, really? I hadn't been noticing.
How about that, right? Well, but harshness also in that I think they know that they're not being stewards of the next generation. They know on both sides of the aisle that there are consequences, but ultimately it seems that the next election prevails over better long-term policy. I mentioned to Governor Haslam, I believe this to be true. I think Joe Manchin's an example. I think Angus King's an example. There are a couple examples on the other side of the aisle. Governors have a different type of sobriety about deficit spending. You know, your thoughts on what we need more of in Washington? What is Washington? And that's just in terms of background, in terms of character, in terms of experience. Something's wrong And I'm not sure, even watching power shift in the last couple of years, that either party's got it better than the other figured out right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just what seems to me is, you know, for anybody who's interested in politics, there's a component of it which is the policy and what you want to do. And there's a component of it which is the game. I mean, you've got to, you know, if you're going to play in the world of politics, you've got to think about how you present things and who your friends are and all this kind of thing. And I think, you know, good political people, I mean, just to take it out of the current day, you go back to an FDR or something like that. I mean, they were great at finding a balance there. I mean, FDR certainly knew how to play the game, but he also got a lot of stuff done that was really good for the country during that particular time. What's happened now is the game is just completely taken over. I mean, it's 99% the game about how do you get and maintain power, how do you get reelected, and so on. And I really think it's going to take a president to get us out of that. I think that's the only place in our country of somebody who has the power to do that. I actually kind of hoped when Obama came in that he would take that up in some ways, and that wasn't the way he thought about things, and so on. But it has gotten very, you know, in the end, when you're playing the game, it's in your interest to politicize everything. You know, it's almost like gangs. I mean, they all have these symbols. You know, you get a tattoo on your arm. Well, you know, there's the D and the R gangs, and you know, the masks are now the symbols, or something, right, or something like that. We all have these things, but I hope that at some point somebody comes along that can just, you know, get people back from that stuff. And again, the thing that gives me hope is it's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's not something that's been baked into our politics for a long time. I mean, I was reading just recently that that back in the 60s, if you took a poll of people's feeling on a contentious issue, and the example given was abortion, okay, what you would find was there were some for and against, but it was not aligned by party. There were roughly equivalent numbers of people in each party who felt each way. And of course, today, I mean, I mean, you can't belong to the Democratic or Republican Party without having the right opinion on that, on that particular issue, because something like that, you know, it's got a sort of a slight political tone to it, but it's also got a lot to do with personal beliefs and religious beliefs and so on. It just has become weaponized as the political party is taking on all these other differences of people and turning them into badges for the party. We have to back away from that.
We'll leave it there. Thanks again for your time.
Again.
Thanks for your leadership. Thanks for your moderation in a moment where there seems to be little on these fiscal issues.
Pleasure being here. Thanks.
Give us 2 more minutes, and we will transition back, and the CEO of the Beacon Center will join me, and the 50th governor of the state of Tennessee, Bill Lee.
The biggest problem isn't even discretionary spending. So, you know, maybe reform should be that we at least have to address and budget for mandatory spending once every 5 years. Like, that would be a great new thing to do. But we can tinker with, you know, the minibuses, the omnibuses, and the deadlines, and whether we're making it biennial budget cycle. We're just tinkering with it then. Like, I don't think these are huge changes, because in the end, the underlying cultural problem is really the problem, which is that Americans demand action. Whether, you know, even the ones who claim to be conservative, they're still demanding their piece of the pie, and they're still demanding action. They still believe that government has left them behind, and their life would be better if government would do something. Well, every time you ask government to do something, that usually involves a bunch of money. And the way incentives work in Washington is, well, the most compassionate, the politician that cares the most, is willing to double the funding on the program that you like the most. And that's how they get your votes. So until Americans stop basically allowing themselves to be bribed by opportunistic politicians that basically, you know, bribe you with more government spending and programs to get your vote, then this is never going to change.
Final point. Make Washington more like Texas. Now, look, that's a throwaway line, right? Easy for us Texans to say. Maybe more like Tennessee. What do I mean by that? I like that in Texas, we meet every other year, and we do so for, 5 months. We need a little bit more of that in Washington. I would go to biennial budgeting. I would make it to where we're only focused on a 2-year cycle, and I would make it to where we can't raise money for the first 6 months when we come in, just like in Texas. They come in, they can't raise money. They got to go do the session. pass a budget, get it done, sine die, and get out. I think we need essentially in Congress something like an appropriation spending cycle where we come in and for the first 4 or 5 months, we do our job and we work towards a balanced budget. We should balance it. And right now, we would just take anything like a 10-year path to balance. And we need to get in there, do it, do our job, and then go do the work over that people are going to do, raising money and stuff about reelection.
We're back to wrap up the 1 hour core part of this event that was enabled by my friend, the President and CEO of the Beacon Center, Justin Owen.
Team effort.
And the 50th governor of our great state, Bill Lee, who's just a great guy. I think you've led here through some tough times. You got baptized by fire. You weren't a politician. You signed up for this job, and I'm not so sure that my friend, the First Lady, would have signed up had she known.
That's a very good point.
Here's what happened. I mean, just in the line, and this is year 2, tornadoes, a pandemic, tornadoes in my part of the state in a pandemic. And so the first question I've got for you.
A bombing? Just right
can we finish that?
Yeah.
The most rapid economic decline in American history, civil unrest that resulted in protests in dozens of counties and cities all across the state, floods that occurred at the end of the pandemic, all of those things, and then were capped off by the bombing on Christmas Day. So it's been a long year.
Well, in almost each of those avenues, you've had to deal a lot with the feds, for better or for worse. And I'm curious, in all those different interactions, whether it's FEMA or whether it's state aid coming, that as I was saying to Governor Haslam, I was with Bo Watson earlier this week, and Senator Watson's explaining, we've got all this money, and really the responsible way to handle it is one-time money. A lot has happened. There's a lot of engagement between states and the federal government right now, probably more than some of us would hope for, certainly in normal circumstances. What have you seen the feds do well, and what have you seen them do that makes you just think, stay out of our business?
Yeah, I've been doing this now for a little over 2 years. The first year had what I would guess was a normal interaction with the federal government with regard to the amount of back and forth. The second year, starting in March, an incredibly inordinate amount of interaction with the federal government. Some of it's been very good, very responsive. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of back and forth about what do you need, a lot of communication. But the longer the pandemic wore on, the more what we saw was government growing, right? So enormous packages of money, policy building on top of existing policy about what direction to go. We really saw an enormous growth of government, in some ways at the expense of the individual across the country. That's very concerning to me. There have been times in my interaction with the federal government where there was a real clear understanding that states need to do what states need to do. But increasingly, it's becoming, here's what we are going to do. And without as much input from states as we had before this pandemic began, or even in the beginning, the first part of it. So it's changed over the course of the year, and in my view, probably headed in the wrong direction.
What about the breakdown between, you talk about the sort of 10th Amendment states versus the feds, but we've seen radically different approaches among the states themselves, and this idea of laboratories of democracy. What have you learned from that experience, looking at a California versus a Tennessee, or a Michigan versus a Florida, and how they've dealt with the pandemic?
Well, you clearly see that there are different outcomes, and there are different approaches that have different implications, and that's good for states to choose their own path. And we can talk a little bit more in a minute about the increasing role of the federal government in all of this process. But even in this laboratory over the last year, you do have states like California, New York, Michigan, that have been much more locked down. For example, their approach to the pandemic was different than Tennessee's. And the results have been different. Not so much with regard to the pandemic, the health side, death rates. Certainly we've had some good numbers in relative to the rest of the country in our nursing home death rate because we had a very targeted approach there. But every state shared their moment in the hot sun during this pandemic. I was on call with governors every week, and this week it was that state, and this week it was that state, and this week it was that state. But now that most of that has flushed out, you have half the states in this country, for example, who have depleted their unemployment trust funds. That's a very clear example of how different states operate differently. We took the vast majority of our federal funding in the first CARES Act and kept our unemployment trust fund solvent above $1 billion to keep from raising taxes on businesses, to keep employers employing people. That's a serious difference, a stark contrast between one philosophical approach and another. And I think we'll see that happen more and more as this plane lands.
You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, well, first of all, most of us became like amateur epidemiologists. You know, we were wrong about everything we thought we knew. And one of the only things I was right about is the silver lining, I think, for the country in the pandemic. When you grow up in a political family, you're always the person who gets the political questions. And I started telling people, we're about to get a crash course in civics education. Because if you watch TV at night, you'd think we have one government in America, and it's in Washington, and whatever Trump does or whatever Biden does is what happens. This is where I think a lot of Americans, maybe until the pandemic, didn't realize, no, we're literally a union of states. You know, we're United States, and governors are in charge, and in our state, county mayors wield a lot of authority, and then, you know, city charters, you know, by virtue of their charter, can do things on their own. So there's a silver lining, and I think people learned a lot about who their governor was, for better or worse. They may not like you as much, they may like you more, but there's I do think there's just a greater awareness. In our corner of the state, Mayor Coppinger, by far and away, has been the most impactful, significant elected official. That's the upside. The downside is we've been bossed around by the government. We've gotten checks direct deposited into our bank accounts. You talked about the role the government's played, particularly the federal role. I worry that the relationship between the government and the governed in America has changed, maybe not forever, but for a generation.
It's dramatically changed over this past year. Now, where we go from here will be very important. So the 10th Amendment is incredibly important. States ought to have the ability to operate differently from one another. You saw so often through this pandemic a raging desire for this state to do what that state had done, or for all the states should do this, or everyone should act the same. I mean, Governor Bredesen was talking about the politicization, the political nature of even a mask. So if you look at the amount of time that was spent in this country on which states have a mask mandate and which ones don't, it became the topic of whether or not we ought to all do one thing or states ought to have individual opportunity. The government grew dramatically. The reach of government grew dramatically. The impact into personal lives from the federal government in particular grew dramatically, and in some states significantly more than others. Now, what that looks like in response to the end of this pandemic will be very important to the country, because
can we roll that back and that pendulum swing back?
I mean, I think it can. I think certainly there are some things that can be rolled back. We're about to get a $2 trillion federal package that, in my view, the country doesn't need. That won't be rolled back, right? So that's going to institute a whole level of new financial input from the federal government and all the strings that come attached to that.
And in a sense, you won't know if we needed it, because if in fact we didn't need it and the economy was going to recover, it'll definitely recover if you throw $2 trillion in the fire.
Well, no,
at
take credit for it.
Yeah,
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Well, at
Yeah.
the expense of another enormous debt
Right.
addition to our country. So we didn't need it. Our state is, thanks to the two men that you just interviewed prior to my sitting here, and our attempts to build upon that fiscal responsibility, our state's one of the lowest tax states in the country. Our state has virtually no debt. We maintained $2 billion between our rainy day fund and our TennCare fund. We have a solvent unemployment trust fund. We have revenue. There are 7 states in America. You talk about experiments over the last year and what the differences and the implications of how the decisions that you made. There are 7 states in America who have had positive economic growth since April 2020, and Tennessee's one of them. That is because of a history of being fiscally responsible as a state, and we will be happy to take the money and determine how to spend it wisely, and we'll do that just like we did in the first CARES Act. But I do think on balance for this nation, a $2 trillion package that 9% of it is being actually spent on COVID relief is arguably not the best thing for the country's debt structure.
And what about the incentive aspect of it too? I think you had an article with Senator Blackburn recently, talking about states that have been managed fiscally conservatively and responsibly are really getting a raw end of this. They're getting punished as a result of this. Do you worry about the bailout nature of rewarding states that have been fiscally irresponsible, reckless spending, enormous amounts of debt, really at our expense in states who we're going to be the ones paying for that in a lot of ways?
That's really true. I don't know that a lot of people have quite seen what just happened. We have an enormous amount of money that's about to be given out to states, and that happened in the CARES Act, but it was distributed based on population, as it ought to be. It sort of logically makes sense to distribute a federal package to states based on the number of people that live in that state. This one has been determined to be delivered based on the unemployment rate. So for those states who really worked hard, because let me tell you, it's hard to balance lives and livelihoods. It's really easy to just shut everything down and say we're going to respond to the pandemic by closing all our businesses. Everybody stay home. We're going to do everything we can to stop this virus. And very easy to do that. Very hard to protect people and protect livelihoods at the same time. But some states did it. They navigated their way through it. They made hard choices. They responded to a lot of pressure to do otherwise, but they strongly and fundamentally believed that personal responsibility plays a big role in something like this past year, and that the government's responsibility is to provide people the opportunity to thrive in the midst of a crisis. So our state has fared well economically. Debt, structure, reserves, no taxes, no new taxes or no elevated taxes, economic recovery, low unemployment rate, and we will now receive about $160 million less than we would receive if it were distributed based on population. A very bad precedent to set from the federal government. And in fact, states that performed well through the pandemic will pay to fund trust, to fund pension plans that were failing in labor unions, for example. Budgets that are operating at a deficit, unemployment trust funds that have been depleted. We will fund those. Tennessee taxpayers will do that in states that performed poorly economically. It's a really bad precedent from my perspective.
Over a 20-year horizon, the 3 governors that we've talked to here have put Tennessee in a position where I think for your grandkids, my kids, it's going to be a great place to live. Maybe a bigger delta between our state and other states than there's been in history. The country's $30 trillion in debt. That's really not the problem. The problem is that we have no plan in Washington on either side of the aisle to stop us from going to 130, 150 trillion.
Yep.
As your kids who are about my age, as we enter retirement, that's what Justin and I are going to be looking at. 30's we're going to say, oh, back in the good old days,
Yeah.
30 trillion. I actually fear that your legacy, that Governor Haslam's legacy, Governor Bredesen's legacy, is threatened by recklessness in Washington. You worry about that? I know you enough to know that your grandkids are a bigger concern to you than re-election or your popularity. And I think we're now taking risks with the country's good name, credit, and that of future generations, and we don't know what the results are going to be, what the consequences may be.
You're absolutely right. You know, I ran a company for 25 years and worked there for 35, and I've thought a lot about this last year and the crisis that we went through and the decisions that we made, and they weren't easy decisions. It wasn't the worst year of my life. I've had crises in my life in other ways, personal crises, a personal crisis that was the worst year of my life, a business crisis sometime back that actually informed me, gave me a lot of information. It informed my decision making through this pandemic because of what I went through in my professional career and almost lost a company. Was fortunate because of some good fiscal decisions to save it and then change the way I thought about fiscal policy within my own company for the next 20 years. Determined how I think about fiscal policy in our state. This country does not follow that sort of fiscal management that I think is important for sustainability. I don't know where that ends. I mean, I don't know where that ends. I think we're in real trouble as a country if we never address the trajectory that we are on from a fiscal mismanagement process.
Justin? You think it ends well? Does it end well? Is there a way that it ends well?
I'm an eternal optimist.
Well, you know, I heard Governor Bredesen say, talking about the toxicity of politics and what would solve it, in his view, was a president. I think a president can begin to solve that problem. Leadership that's committed and courageous. It's hard to say whether that kind of leadership can inspire, because it will be very difficult to turn that ship. It will take courage, not on the part of a president, it'll take courage on the part of members of Congress. I was working on some criminal justice reform work with a fellow named Josh Smith, who's an ex-offender, and we're working on what I think is very important work in the legislature right now. And he said to me, if we can just get enough courageous lawmakers to join in with this effort, we will get this important work done and change the direction. Same is true, I think, with the nation's fiscal policy. It'll take a very strong leader with some very courageous lawmakers to make that change.
Well, I think in the same way that criminal justice reform is a passion of yours, we need a stewardship president. And it could be a Republican or Democrat. Again, I think it's disingenuous to act like one party's got more credibility than the other.
Right, we've heard that today, that it's been both parties that have governed in a philosophical way that's left our kids and grandkids in a much better shape than they otherwise would be.
And I do think it'll be important that we have less of a partisan atmosphere in order for that to happen. So it won't just have to be a great leader, it'll have to be a change in the political atmosphere where people realize together, hey, this is not a partisan issue, this is an American issue, and we have to do this for the sake of the country.
But in structural change, too, beyond just who's elected to the White House, it should matter less who's in the White House, because they shouldn't have that much power, right? Congress needs to take on its responsibility to duly enact laws rather than kick it over to the administrative branch, and executive branch, and then, like with Medicaid block grants and things like that, pull that power back to the states where governors and local elected officials can make better decisions with those dollars than they do in Washington any day of the week.
You mentioned that Medicaid block grant, and it's misunderstood and talked about in a lot of different ways, but it is an example of a state's unique ability to manage a program, and we happen to be really good at TennCare management and efficiency, and therefore we spend less money than most states do on a similar population, giving them the same services. Because of that, with this block grant, we'll be rewarded for that. It's a unique arrangement that's complex, but it gives a state like Tennessee, if you do a good job with this, then you will be rewarded with that, and we will actually be able to serve our Medicaid population, the same people, cut nobody off the rolls, cut no services, add services. That's the goal. That was my vision for it when we pursued it, and we're going to be able to do that. It's a small example of how states understand their own operational efficiencies or their own operation, and therefore should be given the authority to use that to better the country, frankly.
Well, Governor, thank you. Thanks for taking the time, joining us in person. Justin, thanks for opening up this view, and
Yeah, it's nice.
Are we going to get some butts in the stands when it's time?
We sure are.
Time, right?
It's time. I'm ready for it. Thanks all for
All
having
right, we're
me.
going to do one more kind of a bonus session, if you will, as we wrap up. And it's going to be led by two members of the Millennial Debt Commission. When we started the foundation, one of our first major efforts launched last year. It's a national debt commission led by 20 millennial business leaders. Two of them are co-founders of great Tennessee companies, and they, in 2 minutes, are going to lead a conversation with Congressman Mark Green. Congress is still in session, so he's going to be with us remote from Washington. And in the 2-minute break, we're going to run a summary of the September meeting of the Millennial Debt Commission, which featured briefings from a whole slew of people who you'll recognize.
Well, it's an existential threat to our economic mobility.
One of the most important conversations that's taken place about the fiscal future of America in 2020.
The debt has grown by trillions and trillions and trillions.
I think the answer needs always to be now. Well, why postpone till next year what you can do now?
Even folks who represent themselves as being fiscally conservative, they want other people's stuff to be cut, but they don't want their own stuff to be cut.
We love to talk about the debt and deficit when the other party's in power.
I think politics right now reflects. It doesn't lead, it reflects.
The $26 trillion in debt, that's not actually the problem, in my opinion. The problem is we've got no plan whatsoever from here.
We haven't had an adult conversation in this country about debt.
The budget's fake. I mean, that's why they don't pass budgets anymore.
We've become a country full of people asking what the government can do for us, as opposed to asking what we can do for our country.
What are we doing to your generation? What are we going to do to your children's generation?
You are having your pocket picked in what is the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in world history.
Millennials intuitively understand this, that boomers have voted themselves increased benefits for decades.
You can't sit down and agree to disagree and walk away as friends. You can't go to a family gathering and talk politics anymore because it's so toxic. This is crazy, gang. Your generation cannot tolerate that anymore. You ought to say enough's enough.
The hard things that are real are what we really have to do. We have to raise the retirement age. We have to think about means testing. We have to look at the $1 trillion of tax breaks in the budget. We have to control healthcare costs. Like, there are real choices to be made.
And my amendment would close this loophole and achieve those savings.
There's no longer an actuarially sound Social Security.
I appreciate what you guys are doing because that's where the conversation has to start.
And Weston, I want to thank you in particular for building this whole important effort. You all are going to have a voice that we have really been lacking for quite some time.
All right, welcome back. My name is Nick Mako. I'm one of the founding members of the Millennial Debt Commission, a businessman from Chattanooga, joined by Cam. Cam, you can introduce yourself.
Hey, my name's Cam Duty. I'm founder of a company called Bellhop based in Chattanooga, Tennessee as well, and commissioner on the Debt Commission. Congressman, it's great to see you here.
Great to be with you.
Congressman, you know, we're both in the business world. We don't live and breathe this. You know, you just got done saying a minute ago you're in the thick of it in Washington, sort of in the lion's den, if you will. Can you just, for the uninitiated or the layman such as me and Cam, can you sort of explain the issue at hand? Like, what is the problem? Like, we clearly are spending a lot in Washington, but explain to somebody who's not paying attention day to day, what is this impending sort of catastrophe that we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great word for it, catastrophe. Well, first, you know, we kind of think of things in business terms. I mean, I ran a healthcare company, founded it, and sold it. You think about the next dollar you invest, what you expect to get from that. You know, we call it return on investment. In the government, we're supposed to think like that, only we don't. The only return on investment that a lot of people think about nowadays is re-election. And that's a tragedy. So you get massive spending, bailouts of blue cities in this most recent spending stimulus bill. And it's purely to empower people. That's it. The costs, though, the costs are astronomical. We're looking at now a GDP, a debt to GDP ratio by the end of this year of 102%. By 31, we think it'll be 107%. And the CBO is predicting that by 2051, just 30 years from now, a debt to GDP ratio of 202% on our current glide path. We are in trouble. I mean, if you look at Part A of Medicare, it will be out of money in 3 years. So the catastrophic spending that's happened it's got very serious, you know, negative effects for our country. And you think about it in terms of growth, you know, GDP, whenever the more you borrow and you're competing with the private sector for capital, and that impact on rates and other things has a significant deleterious effect on growth. And we need growth in order to fix the debt. We're in a massive catch-22 right now.
Yeah, so I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that? I think it's hard for some people to wrap their mind around the consequences. And you just mentioned, you know, for example, Medicare running out of money. And can you give or paint a picture of what some of these consequences could be for people? Like, when is that going to come home to folks like me in Tennessee?
Yeah, so they're going to either print money to pay this debt. They either print money, or you have inflation and inflate the debt away, or you default on it. I mean, those are our options: pay the debt, you know, inflate the debt away, and all of those have again very negative impact on business. If you create inflation, that's an increased cost to doing business. It eats into margins for businesses. You get less economic investment and a further negative impact on growth. And debt itself is actually a pull on growth. Actually, I don't know if you guys can see this. I have a graph. Or if you're not, I don't know if you're able to zoom in, or I can zoom in for you. But
yeah, we got it.
Can you see that?
Yep.
So a study was done by Heritage, 22 countries over 110 years, the depressive effect of debt on economic growth. Countries that had no debt had an average of 3.5% growth over that 110 years. If their debt to GDP ratio was 90% or higher, their growth was only 2.3%. If their debt to GDP ratio was 120% or higher, their growth was only 1.2%. And I have the nice little "you are here." You know, the United States is sitting at 102%. And as I said earlier, in 2031, we think it'll be 107. In 2051, 202%. And by the way, the highest debt to GDP ratio we've ever had as a country was 106% after World War II. So we're going into very quickly territory we have no experience in. But we know for a fact that that kind of debt slams growth, and you have, they call it debt trap, because you have to have growth in order to pay your way out of the debt. We would have to average greater than 4.5% growth over the next 20 years to get out of the debt. But the debt itself is causing, a slowdown in growth. So that's the debt trap.
So I'd like to ask you a question. On a lot of these meetings that we've had with the commission, we've talked to some super smart folks in Washington. We had a conversation with a certain lawmaker that essentially summarized the problem that both sides of the aisle, everyone in Washington understands that this is a problem. It's that their constituents don't care about it right now.
Yeah, there were some studies that were just done that showed, very interesting, and this is just weeks ago, it was like number 8 or 10 in the ranking of what the most important issues are for the American people. Debt, and they're just not even thinking about it anymore. What you're doing is helping the business people, the Tennesseans who are watching this, it informs them. So thank you for doing that. But this is a freight train rolling down a hill and the bridge is out.
So my question is, it really comes down to courage, because if you take the oath of office, you're not just there to make decisions that your constituents are telling you to make. You're there out ahead of them to see the problems that they don't see coming and to make those decisions. Other than creating awareness through methods like this, how do we get to the point where lawmakers are willing to have the courage to make decisions that have almost no personal incentive alignment for their careers on the Hill?
Yeah, because really the biggest, the big three, right, are, I think it's 15 years. Within 15 years, our entire revenue will be consumed by Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So we're 15 years from that being our entire budget, or at least the revenue that we collect. So to fix our problem, the only real fix is to fix Social Security and Medicaid, which means you may have to increase the retirement age. Now, it actually solves two problems. I think when all this stimulus money gets into the economy, we're going to get some growth because of it. And what's going to wind up being the choke point is employees. Right? I mean, so the labor pool is going to wind up being the choke point. The labor pool was the choke point pre-COVID, right? I mean, we had unemployment. We were essentially at full employment as a country. So if you raise the retirement age, you create more employees that are out there in the labor pool, which solves that problem. And then B, you save money. And I mean, it literally, if you adjust that retirement age just a minimal amount, it fixes the whole problem. But the problem is the politician who has to go back and say, okay, we're going to raise the retirement age. That politician knows he's done after that term. And so it would have to be pretty much everybody agreeing to do it, because one guy isn't going to go out there and be the lone wolf and just go away and not be in the game anymore. But if you want to fix America's problem with spending, you've got to fix the big three. And the appetite to do so is almost zero.
You pointed, Congressman, to the slowdown in growth on your whiteboard behind you. Are there any other repercussions that you see that we're already starting to feel? For example, are we seeing inflation? I mean, you highlighted healthcare and getting healthcare under control. I've heard and read some theories that part of skyrocketing healthcare is already a form of inflation that we're starting to feel already. Do you think there's any truth to that? Are there any other, is there any other repercussions of this debt that we are already experiencing that maybe the average person is just not paying attention to?
Yeah, so one of the things that people aren't paying attention to is the percentage of the debt that is, the interest on the loans. So there's that downstream effect. It decreases our purchasing power. So if let's say we want a $2 trillion a year budget, as the interest payments on the loan increase, that decreases discretionary spending. At some point, it impacts things like, the Department of Justice or the Department of Defense, all bad things. The other side of this thing is about 40% of our debt is foreign held. And our number one, debt creditor, I guess is the right word, is China. So the very country that we consider our greatest competitor, some would say enemy, and you could look at some of the things that they've done and make a pretty good argument that they're an enemy. We actually owe them, and we pay them that interest money every year. In fact, the interest on our debt to China is enough to buy them an aircraft carrier fully loaded with planes every year. So this debt, gluttony that America has, or America's Congress has, is sacrificing national security. So the downstream effects, and I like your question because it's more than just economic growth. There are a lot of aspects and negative impacts to all of this debt.
Could you explain for maybe some of the people watching, there's sort of a new theoretical idea that's been percolating, on the left, that you can just keep borrowing, that's okay, and if you just keep borrowing, and then hopefully growth covers it over, and there will be no consequence. And so it's sort of this big gamble that we're taking. Could you explain that theory to maybe some of the people that are watching and your perspective on it?
I've heard it in committee. I've heard them say things like, "Oh, these Republicans seem to think that there's an end to debt," and I just think it's laughable. You can't look at history, and that's how we make decisions. I'm a business guy. I'm a medical professional too. I'm a physician. I use data to make decisions. And if you look at the data is pretty consistent. Now, in the past few years, we have spent tons of money, and the inflationary bubble hasn't happened, and rates have stayed pretty low. So we've got about 3 to 5 years of data here that it's sort of like a ticking time bomb, in my opinion. But others would submit that that's enough to say, okay, you can borrow as much as you want. The only trick to that is we're the reserve currency, so we can borrow money or print money. But at the point that China or some other country's currency gets strong enough to take over from us for international trade, and then we're screwed, and we can't do anything about it. So that's sort of the ticking time bomb. And China's economy, you think about it like this. If China's economy gets to per capita GDP parity with us, their overall economy will be 4 times the size of ours. When people let that sink in, their economy will be 4 times the size of ours if their per capita GDP equals ours. So, I think it's a ticking time bomb. But there are people up here making this argument that debt doesn't matter anymore. You can borrow as much as you want. That's certainly not true of credit card debt, personal individual credit card debt, or a business.
What would their rebuttal be when you brought up that point to their argument?
That's when they flip to name calling. That's how the other side of the aisle works.
Okay.
I'd probably be called a racist or something because I think you ought to pay your debt.
Right.
Another question along the similar lines. What would you say to the response like that? Republicans maybe don't have much credibility on this issue. That when Republicans hold power, they go ahead and spend on their priorities. And obviously, our previous president didn't seem to have much of an aversion to debt in his life or in government. So, what would you say to that kind of rebuttal?
Yeah, I can't disagree with it. Republicans have been big spenders too. We probably less so than Democrats, but a lot of people here in Congress, they want to spend that money. You know, I'm a little bit of a defense hawk, so, you know, I want the money going to defense, but good night. Some of the stuff in this most recent stimulus package is just, it's pork to the max. And it, you know, it's unnecessary and it's going to hurt our country. So, but there are plenty of Republicans who overspend.
So we're about up on time. I think it was 20 minutes. Is that right? I guess what I would want to leave it with you, Congressman, is what would you say to the next generation millennials as recipients of sort of the consequences of this big issue? What would you say to us as we face that, and how would you have us look at that so that we can, you know, face that problem head on?
Yeah, well, we need you guys to get loud about it. You know, you're paying into Social Security right now, and it's not going to be there on its current structure. And that's unfair to you. You know, George Bush, the second George W. Bush, attempted to create a privatized retirement system and was just shot down, completely shot down by the left. But we need you guys to get really loud about this, because Social Security is not going to be there, and you're going to pay into it for the next 10 or 15 years, and then it's not going to be there. So get loud, call congressmen, you know, tell them we got to get this fixed. That's the best thing that you can do. And then, of course, you know, have a 401k. Save your own money, because if this plane keeps flying into the ground, at some point it's going to crash.
Yep, sure. Well, we appreciate it. This is super important, and we appreciate you being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman.
See ya.
Bye-bye.